a wound on Foster's neck on page 2 of his report. This finding was in agreement with 2 of the rescue workers who testified before the Whitewater grand jury that they too saw a gunshot wound on Foster's neck. Incredibly, in the official autopsy report on Vincent Foster, a gunshot wound to the head is listed, but the wound on the neck is completely left out. The official autopsy conducted by Dr. Beyer states that there was a large 1 by 1 1/4 inch exit wound found on Foster's head. Both Fisk and Starr in their final reports similarly maintain that there was an exit wound on Foster's head. However, this is in direct conflict with those who examined the body at the scene. A .38 special will take the back of your head off, blood and brain matter everywhere, yet no skull fragments or brain matter were found by the FBI or Park Police. 2 days after Vincent Foster's body was discovered in Fort Marcy Park, an FBI memo was sent to then Acting Director Floyd Clark. It says in part, quote, "Preliminary results of the autopsy include the finding that a .38 caliber revolver, constructed from 2 different weapons, was fired into the victim's mouth with no exit wound," unquote. This was in agreement with Detective John Rowland, who examined Foster's body at the scene. He agreed that there was no exit wound, and in fact stated that he thought the bullet might still be lodged in Foster's head. Paramedics Corey Ashford and Roger Harrison put the body in a bag for transport to the morgue, yet neither of them saw an exit wound or any blood, either on the body or on the ground beneath the body. This was in agreement with Dr. Hout, who examined the body at the scene and wrote in his report that the wound was mouth to neck. Paramedic Todd Hall was one of the first to arrive. He testified before the grand jury that he saw 2 men running away from the scene into the woods. Paramedic Richard Arthur, who had attended to 25 to 30 gunshot deaths in his 9 years as a rescue worker, believed it was a homicide. "I've just never seen a body lying so perfectly straight," he said. His colleague, Corey Ashford, also had coded the death as a homicide. For 4 months, Rodriguez probed the case. He called witnesses before a grand jury and soon discovered serious indications of a cover-up. By the early spring of 1995, he was starting to probe a hypothesis that the crime scene at Fort Marcy Park had been staged, that the gun had most likely been planted in Foster's hand, and that a crucial photograph of Foster's neck and head had been falsified. He turned to his boss, Kenneth Starr, for support. Nothing was done to resolve the matter. In March 1995, Rodriguez resigned. The only serious investigation ever conducted into the death of Vincent Foster came to an abrupt end. The confidential witness had stopped at Fort Marcy Park and had ventured about 700 feet into the wooded groves where he spotted a body lying in the dense foliage. He looked as if he'd been dead for a long time. "I mean hours," he said. The bed of dried leaves below the body had been very heavily trampled, and his hands were neatly next to his body with the palms up. He said under oath to a congressional delegation that he saw no weapon, no gun. There was nothing in Foster's hands. A Park Police Polaroid shows a .38 Colt revolver hooked on Foster's thumb. It was made from parts of at least 2 separate weapons, and it had 2 different serial numbers. The only recorded sale to gun retailers of both serial numbers was in 1913, and that was too old to trace. Foster's fingerprints were not found on the gun, although a print belonging to someone else was found under one of the detachable grips. A .38 Special has a fierce recoil and can throw one's hand back over their head. However, the large sight on the gun did not damage Foster's teeth or gum tissue, and the gun was neatly at his side. Residents of homes as close as 300 yards away were never interviewed by the Park Police as to whether they had heard a gunshot. The bullet was never found. No matching ammunition was found in Foster's house. Also, note the heavy foliage around the body, which is inconsistent with the dirt pathway in front of the second cannon where the police claim the body was found. Foster would have had to walk 700 feet into the park, yet the FBI lab tests found no coherent soil on Foster's shoes. Investigators doing simulation walks found an abundance of soil on their shoes. Two homicide detectives who performed their own 2-month investigation into the Foster case concluded that the crime scene had likely been staged, with the gun placed in Foster's hand to make it look like a suicide. This report, funded by the Western Journalism Center in California, was prepared by Vincent Scalise and Fred Santucci, both veteran homicide experts from the New York City Police Department. Two witnesses, Mark and Judy, were interviewed by the FBI in April 1994. They drove a white Nissan into the parking lot at Fort Marcy Park. Judy said she saw a man sitting in Vince Foster's Honda. Mark said that a man with long blonde hair had been standing by the open hood of Foster's car. Blonde hairs were later found on Foster's undershirt, his trousers, belt, socks, and shoes. But the FBI never tried to identify these hairs. Kenneth Starr concluded his report in July 1997 without calling these two witnesses before the grand jury. Another witness, Patrick Knowlton, stopped by Fort Marcy Park to relieve himself. He saw a car and Foster's suit jacket folded over the driver's seat. But it was not Foster's car. He also saw a threatening Hispanic man on watch in the parking lot of Fort Marcy Park. After telling the FBI what he saw, Mr. Knowlton was asked not to mention what he saw to the press. Mr. Knowlton agreed. 17 months later, he discovered through an investigative reporter his statements to the FBI had been changed. Knowlton's description of the unoccupied car in the lot was twisted, so it could have been Vince Foster's, even though his real statement rules out any possibility of the car being Foster's. The time he was at the park is expanded. It fails to say that Knowlton could pick the suspicious character out of a lineup. Through his attorney, Patrick Knowlton submitted a 20-page evidential insert to the 3-judge panel that appointed Kenneth Starr. As he put it, to make sure that the report was full and complete. Attached was Exhibit 1, which is a map of the cars in the Fort Marcy lot. Knowlton was parked next to an older model Honda that was not Vince Foster's car. According to the official record, the best estimates put the time of Mr. Foster's death at between 2 and 4 p.m. However, Mr. Foster's body was discovered at 5:45 p.m., or approximately 70 minutes after Patrick had left the park. Mr. Foster, therefore, could not have driven to the park in his Honda. Exhibit 2 is a map depicting the harassment Patrick suffered. The day he was subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury, he was harassed by at least 25 men who would walk toward him or came at him from behind with threatening glares in their eyes. This technique is known to federal intelligence and investigative agencies, and its objects are twofold. 1, to intimidate and warn witnesses in connection with his grand jury testimony, and 2, to destabilize him and discredit his testimony before the grand jury. In this exhibit, Mrs. Foster could identify only a silver gun. So FBI agents apparently showed Lisa Foster a silver gun, told her it was found in Mr. Foster's hand, and falsely reported that she identified the black gun found in Mr. Foster's hand as belonging to Mr. Foster. And yet another exhibit shows that the FBI concealed the gunshot wound in Mr. Foster's neck by concealing the contents of the medical examiner's report, which states that there was a gunshot wound in